Okay.
Light control.
Are you controlling the lights? Yes, there is a light control,
Okay.
but you're out of control.
It's automated.
Okay. So you're not in the loop. Okay, the first thing I'd like to thank everyone involved in the program. We finished our observations at Vesta, and we're on our way to Ceres. We were able to do a lot more than we had planned to do. We did not promise NASA, and we did not put it in our budget to do everything that we were able to accomplish. We were able to spend more time at Vesta, which was very important, because the solar panels were more efficient than we had planned for or allowed for, and we were able to use the system more efficiently, get to Vesta early, do more maneuvering, get to Ceres faster than we had otherwise planned. We're also grateful. No, I don't need that. We're also very grateful for the support that we received, both from NASA and the prodigious efforts of the Dawn teams, the various teams, including participating scientists who joined us in the middle of our way out to Vesta. Okay. Now, I should say a few words on the importance of studying Vesta. First of all, the meteoritic data were used to unfold the history of the formation of the solar system in the years before we were able to get to Vesta, and these data made very specific predictions about Vesta as the parent object of the HED meteorites. And when we got to Vesta, Vesta was pretty much exactly what the geochemists had told us, and I think that's a feather in the cap for the geochemists. Vesta is important also because it's the largest basaltic asteroid and is still intact. Being intact is really important in this business because then you can really understand better the whole body and what happened to it over history. Vesta is very massive. It's massive enough to display the large-scale planetary processes that you'd expect in a body that was just trying to become a planet. It's sort of like a teenage planet. Wasn't quite full planet scale, planetary scale processes, but it has precursors to all of those things, and that's important for us because we've got a simpler system here, a system that can then, because it's simpler, teach us more about some of the complex processes that we're seeing on other bodies, and I think especially about Mars and Mercury, which we're also exploring in parallel to Vesta. I think we can learn some things at Vesta that will help study the other bodies. Also, Vesta has recorded early solar system processes and done so fairly reliably, even though a little bit has got erased over the last 4.5 billion years. But still, there's going to be surprises in the Vesta data, things that we had absolutely no inkling of before that we will be finding and reporting in the future. Now, let me just go quickly over some of the initial observations. Vesta has an iron core and a basaltic crust. We found that out fairly early by looking at the gravity data and our visual observations. Vesta formed within 1.5 million years of the very beginning of the solar system. That was told to us by the geochemists, but we verified that by looking at Vesta and seeing that the predictions in other areas were true too. The cratering record that we see out there is consistent with our present understanding of the cratering events that are going on in the present solar system. We understand the cratering record in terms of our models of cratering. The surface is rugged, more rugged than you might have guessed, but as rugged as you should have expected. And that affects the cratering record because most of the craters occur on hillsides because there's hillsides everywhere. We found that there were two large craters. We were expecting one, at least one. We found two near the southern pole, but not right centered on the pole. And then we saw dark and bright material. We expected a high albedo surface because you could see that from Earth, but we could not see the dark patches in that high albedo material, and that was a surprise that we got when we arrived at Vesta. Okay, just take a look here at the topography, and you can see in this map of the southern polar regions the central mound in the Rhea Silvia Basin, and also the center of the earlier Venonea Basin that got affected by the impact that formed Rhea Silvia. The crust has been removed completely, or at least the upper crust has been removed completely, and some claim that it has eroded down to the mantle, and put a lot of material into space as the vestoids. However, we expected to see olivine down there, and we don't see olivine yet we haven't identified it as yet in the spectra. And that is somewhat of a surprise to us. Everywhere we see is diagonite. If we look in the equatorial regions, we can see some highly cratered terrains and some high relief terrains here, some high topography. And we also see these prominent troughs that we will hear more about after my talk. And in this particular derivation of the stereo topography, we only went up to 40 degrees north, but I'll show you the north in just a moment. If we take a look at the north, this is now using the Gaskell shape model. We can see that there is interesting terrain in the North Pole, but no huge basins like we saw in the south, and no clear evidence in this region of having disrupted antipodal effects to the craters in the south. We were expecting, because of things that we'd seen on other bodies, to see disruption at the antipodes of those two large impacts. Now, it may be, this is speculation, that the core had some role in sort of stabilizing this, so the fact that we have a sizable iron core may be important. If we take a look at the south versus the north, the south over here has this central mound, but it's been cleared pretty much of crust around the central mound. There's sharp rims on the craters and on the Rhea Silvia Basin, and a very young surface down here. So we think that Rhea Silvia is only 1 billion years or so old. Something that I pointed out earlier that surprised us are those ridges or troughs around the equator. If you move into the north, then the surface is more heavily cratered, and the large craters are more subdued. It's an older surface. If we just take a look at the crater size distribution, so the cumulative number of craters along the vertical axis and the crater diameter going from small to large across the bottom, we see that different regions have different amount of cratering. In green, the Vesta measurements of the Rhea Silvia floor are pretty low in their counts, the size frequency distribution here. But if you go into the highly cratered terrain, the blue squares here, it is approaching saturation on this line here. So this is a fairly old surface, and other parts are intermediate. Vesta has a positional diversity across the surface. We can see that in the color data obtained by the framing camera. This can be due to excavation in part, but there are perhaps interior processes that led to the mineral diversity that we see on the surface. One of the ways that we, another way, and an important way that we see the mineralogy on the surface is to look at the spectra obtained by the VIR imaging spectrometer, and it makes by taking lines across this surface, builds up an image, but does so at a variety of different wavelengths. If we take a look at one of those scans at one spot, we'll see these bands, and the band depth and the band centers of these bands give us an idea of what the minerals are on the surface. And as I said, diogenite is a very frequent type of pyroxene across the surface, but the north is more eucritic. This is just mapping with the VIR and using the band depths and band centers to identify the different regions. And you can see that you get a fairly uniform spectral behavior over the central mound. Looking at the crater rims and the crater walls, we see the bright and dark material that's so prevalent across the surface. And what we're wondering about is how did the dark material get in Vesta? Is it endogenic or exogenic? Was it transported from afar, or was it some process within? You can see that the different elevations here where you can see a particular elevation here where the dark material is, and there's bright material above it. So it's an interesting story that we have to investigate better. The varying albedo across the surface, varying darkness or brightness, can be replicated by just two end members and mixing different amounts of bright and dark material. We also found, much to our surprise, even more surprising than the dark material, was pitted terrain. Now this is, on the left is the pitted terrain on Mars, on the right is the pitted terrain on Vesta, and that's evidence of devolatilization of the surface and the sinking of the material. There's no rims on these craters. These are just sinkholes, basically, on the surface. And that suggests that there was a lot of volatiles in the surface at one point, at least for a short period of time. We're still investigating that, and I think that investigation will lead us on to very interesting conclusions. Another complementary study to that is to take a look at the gullies, and there are two types of craters that have gullies, and one type has very straight gullies, and the other type has very sinuous and intersecting gullies. This looks like what you'd expect for dry flows, and this looks like what you'd expect from liquid flows. So that also supports, and there's the pits in the bottom of Cornelia. So that also supports this idea of fluid flow on Vesta, at least for a short period of time. We have a grand spectrometer seeing the gamma rays and neutrons, and it can tell us whether there's hydrogen. This is only in the upper layers, this the upper half meter, but it tells us that there has been hydrogen probably transported with the dark material, perhaps, to Vesta over history. As I said, we've got a core and a mantle and crust, and we've made models of that. But one thing we haven't found yet is the olivine that we expect to show itself when we have deep erosion of the crust with large impacts. The surface gravity has a little bit of a surprise, although not a total surprise, but that the gravity and topography are very closely correlated, and that's not what we get in most other bodies. And so finally, Vesta has witnessed 4.5 billion years of solar system history, and I think it's recorded that history very well for us. The chemical predictions of Vesta interior was very accurate. Vesta is a simpler system than other terrestrial basaltic bodies, and therefore understanding its behavior not only may be a little bit easier, but be a little more unambiguous and helpful in other studies. Now, Vesta is now beginning to provide those lessons, and I think that in this area of the cratering and the two types, the dry and perhaps liquid gullies, is one of those areas where we can help the other projects out of their conundrums at the present time. Finally, there are 3 more talks this afternoon. I invite you to stay for them, looking at the tectonics with Deborah Bukowski, looking at comparative planetology of large basins, Paul Schenk, and the surface mineralogy will be by Christina De Sanctis, will be given by Jean-Philippe Combe. Thank you.
Any questions for Chris? And I think this is being recorded, and so speak.
Keep it clean.
Okay, well,
there's a question.
When you talk about recording the history of the solar system, is there any evidence here about the phenomenon of the light heavy bombardment?
Yes, there is, and we have not got to the stage yet of really interpreting it, but I think the team would agree that the late heavy bombardment in its way at Vesta affected Vesta. That doesn't mean that the late heavy bombardment we see on the moon was identical to on Vesta, but that history affected both of them. Paul, do you agree? No. Okay.
Okay. Is there another question? Okay. Thank Chris again. Our next speaker is Deborah Bukowski from KTL, and she's going to reveal more mysteries about Vesta. Here's the thing for moving the thing on that so that gets recorded.
All right, so this is modeling of giant impact into a differentiated asteroid and implications for the large-scale troughs on Vesta. And I have way too many slides and not enough time to cover them, so I'm just going to keep on going. So images of Vesta reveal the presence of these large-scale troughs, these structural features on the surface of the asteroid. And this includes the equatorial set of troughs that you can see right here. And then also one major trough that's extending up from an angle to the northwest from those equatorial troughs and some associated features. So our analysis of these structures was mostly done to contribute to our knowledge of the stress history of Vesta. What was happening on Vesta that could possibly explain features of this size that are considerably larger than anything we've seen on other asteroids. So for this project, we used the small body mapping tool, which utilizes the Vesta shape model. So we can map out any feature. We drape our framing camera images right directly onto the shape model so that when we map on them, we have a three-dimensional aspect to every feature. We can determine the length, the width, and the height. And this is especially useful on these irregularly shaped bodies where if you map in a traditional way like you would on a planet, you get very distorted orientations. So the other feature of this particular mapping program is that we can make topographic profiles. Given the 3D component, each structure chase can then be modeled to define a plane that cuts through the asteroid. This is what we use instead of being able to go straight up to a fracture and put a Brunton compass on it and figure out a strike and a dip. So we model these planes through the asteroid and figure out how they dip and try and look at how different structures correlate to each other and whether or not they could be related in formation or not. So basically, if we have a plane, then we have a pole to the plane. And if you are a structural geologist and you have poles to the plane and they cluster, then you know that you have a set of similarly oriented planes. So here's a stereo net. This is not a set of similarly oriented planes. This is actually an example of not oriented planes. And so these dots are the poles, and you can see they're widely scattered everywhere. And so this is not a set of related structures. So the Equatorial Troughs. These are linear structures. They encircle the asteroid. They're roughly aligned with the equator. They are expressed very clearly for over 240 degrees of longitude. They encompass more than 2/3 of the asteroid. These are very wide, flat floor troughs. They're deep. They're bounded by steep scarps. There's sets for a small range past these very well-defined ones that are similar in orientation, but they're muted. They look like they might have been the same feature, but something covered them, some ejecta or whatever. Also in this set would be grooves, smaller structures, and then also pit crater chains, which are a feature that is generally believed to be extensional features that have been covered completely, and then dilational features kind of get that covering material to start percolating down. You get pits that form. Saturnalia Fossa is the largest of these equatorial troughs. This is the type locale. It's around 465 kilometers long. Maximum width is 21.8 kilometers, but it can be narrow, as narrow as 14.5. And we have some topographic profiles across this. It is not consistent along its length. You actually see in some areas a typical flat floor trough. In other areas, it looks like it has more, one side of the feature is accumulating most of the displacement. And actually, as we go along this, we can actually see places where the fault pinches out and where we have fault linkages. So it's very much responding like a terrestrial fault system. This actually has about 5 kilometers of cumulative displacement along it, and the northern fault accommodates the bulk of the displacement. There are 86 other equatorial structures in the set. They range from 19 to 380 kilometers long, with widths up to 15 kilometers. Most of these smaller features have about 2 kilometers of cumulative displacement. And where there's no troughs, there are these grooves and pit crater chains, which one hypothesis could be that this is troughs that have been covered by ejecta from one of these large southern basins. And analysis indicates that most of these features are coplanar. You can see this nice tight cluster of the poles right there in the center, indicating that these features all formed in the same event. The other set of troughs, the northern troughs, identified to the northwest, it extends almost as far south as the equatorial troughs. These seem to be older, just qualitatively they seem older. There's shallower walls, there's rounded edges, there's infilling, they're more heavily cratered. Saturnalia Fossa right here is the largest of the northern troughs. It's at least 366 kilometers long. And I say at least because right over here in the far corner you can see a crater. This is Lepida crater. It covers the entire trough in that area. And then there's another trough to the south that I would say is an extension of Saturnalia Fossa, but you can't actually see where it connects because this crater impacted it. And then when we originally did our mapping, there was still this completely shadowed area to the north. And now that we have northern coverage, Jennifer Scully, who is doing the mapping of that region, has extended Saturnalia Fossa up to the north. So it could be as long as 851 kilometers. Maximum width, 39.2 kilometers, and topographic profiles indicate that it's a graben. We have some areas, just like Devalia, where there's flat floor trough formation, other areas where it seems like one fault is accommodating the bulk of the displacement. And when we look at the other structures, it would appear that they are also coplanar with a nice tight cluster of poles. Now, if we compare this to the southern basins, these two southern basins have the center of their basins are where these white stars are. And if we compare that to where the poles of the two fracture planes are, they're very, very similar, which would indicate that it is these giant fractures that are responsible for trough formation. Now, on other smaller asteroids, we have seen fractures in a similar orientation around larger impacts, but they tend to be smaller. So this is one of the reasons why we first looked at this idea of perhaps these giant impacts could have formed these structures. And what's nice is that the older northern troughs actually correspond to the older basin, Venenea. So this does seem like these faults could have been formed by the giant impact events. And we've seen these linear structures in a similar orientation around impacts on Ida, Eros, and possibly even Lutetia. These are smaller scale structures, like I said, so they're mostly just grooves, and sometimes there's some flat floor troughs, but they're much smaller in scale than what we're seeing on Vesta, shallower without the same kind of displacement. So this implies there's something different about Vesta, and what could it be? Well, we know Vesta has a sizable core and likely a mantle and a crust. And I say likely because if anyone saw Carol Raymond's talk yesterday, we have this crust material, and she showed a range of potential densities where there was this one where it was a bulk one density body, so basically a two-layer body, and then you kind of phase that out so that you have a core and a mantle, and you can get density differences. But basically, you at least have a core and then probably a mantle and crust. So perhaps Vesta has these planetary type structures because it has a planetary type interior. So as others have done, we have done a CTH hydrocode model, and we were specifically trying to find fracture. Where would Vesta fracture? So this is the minimum density gradient. This is the two-layer problem. It's a 530-kilometer sphere with a 220-kilometer iron core. And so this would be the bulk density of Vesta in that two-layer problem. And I'm just going to run a movie because it's cool. And this shows the shock wave that results from the impact. You can just see how that shock wave kind of goes around the core and how the core affects the shock wave. But what we really want, that's not what I wanted to do. What we really want to do is look here in the equatorial region, where on Vesta we're actually seeing large-scale fractures. And the model actually shows that there's considerably deep fracturing occurring in that region where on Vesta we actually observed fractures. And just for interest, here's the non-differentiated model. And you can see there's a little bit of fracturing here, but it's not nearly as deep. So this would be consistent with what we see on the smaller bodies like Ida and Eros, where there's grooves and there's fracturing, but there's not necessarily faulting, and you don't have these big megastructures like we're seeing on Vesta. And also, just because it's cool, look at the difference in the stress field. Okay, so that was our minimum density contrast model. Here's our maximum contrast, where we have a 530-kilometer sphere, and there's a 20-kilometer lower density crust with a 290, well, we have this remaining mantle with the 220-kilometer iron core. So we modeled this as dunite, and then put in a lower density basalt analog crust. And you can see actually there's way more fracturing actually than we really need with this model. And there's also antipodal fracturing. So there's fracturing here, and then down here, this isn't so much fracturing as like an uplift of the North Pole. And just for reference, because this is a lower density material, here's the homogeneous model with this lower density material. What if it was a lower density Vesta? And you can actually see we lose the fracturing at the equator, but we still have all of this opposite pole fracturing. So, just in conclusion, our first order models have yet to fully mimic the observations that we're seeing in Vesta. We haven't modeled all of the potential density gradients. We have played with changing what the impactor is and what the size is, just to see what effect that would have, and I don't have time to show all the models. But what's really important, the takeaway message, is that these models do show that the density contrast in Vesta's differentiated interior affects the stresses that result from giant impact. And it's this impedance mismatch that we suggest is responsible for the development of Vesta's planetary-style troughs at the equator. Thank you.
Questions for Deborah? I've got one question, and that is that it appears that the troughs related to Vaniniya are more dramatic, larger than the ones associated with Rhea Silvia. And yet Vaniniya is a smaller crater.
Yes, but Vaniniya happened first. So I think with Saturnalia is the one that's really big. The other northern troughs are actually smaller than the equatorial. Saturnalia it's the one that actually goes down far south enough that it would be affected by the equatorial fraction that occurred during Rhea Silvia. So you have the Rhea Silvia impact, and I think that caused reactivation of the fault, especially in the south. Towards the south, you actually have more cumulative displacement. South of that Lepida crater that I showed you that is actually like cutting Saturnalia in half. So you have 7 to 8 kilometers of cumulative displacement close to the equatorial troughs, and then less cumulative displacement as you go north. And also, it's older, so there's a lot more. I mean, it's widening as there's downslope motion. So we have all these mass movements along the walls, and that's kind of bringing it wider. It's not as deep as the equatorial trough, so it's infilling but getting wider. And then there was reactivation. Possibly also some activation. There have been models that have suggested that there might be some shear in that area. So you have the Rhea Silvia impact. You have normal faulting at the equator, but some shear up there towards the north. And if you already have a pre-existing fault, then you can get shear along it, and that would also result in widening an existing fault.
What if the impact occurred while the core was still partially molten? Could that have affected it?
I don't know. New model.
More funding.
Yeah. I can model that and see. I would think that, yes, it would affect it. How it would affect it, I cannot guess. Perhaps somebody in the room would have. I do have work ahead of me. That's the problem. The interesting aspect of doing these models is that there's always new permutations to try.
Another question?
Mm-hmm. They do not cut Vestalia Terra, which if you've seen some of the other Vesta talks that have been given this week, Vestalia Terra is the area that Carol Raymond was saying has a particularly large Bouguer gravity anomaly. It's also topographically the highest area of Vesta, and these features do not cut it.
Okay, thank you very much, Deborah. Our next speaker is Paul Schenk, who will talk about the morphologies of all these big impacts on Vesta. Can you here, move this around so the cursor can be recorded?
Okay. All right, thanks. As we've seen in the previous speakers, Vesta has been hammered by at least 2 large impacts at the South Pole. And Dawn's global mapping of Vesta gives us an unprecedented look at large impacts on small bodies. Now, we can look at this in 2 ways, 2 thematic ways. One is, what do these basins tell us about the impact process, impact mechanics in a low-gravity world, which Vesta is? And what do the impacts tell us about the interior of Vesta itself, which is something that Deborah has been working on? And obviously, I barely have time to even touch on one of these, so I'm going to talk about the first one, and that is to look at the impact mechanics and morphology. Let's see, now how does this?
Oh, yeah, I think you just click it.
Very good. Okay, just to review what Dawn saw at Vesta. Reyes Sylvia is the large impact at the South Pole. This thing here, and it's roughly bowl-shaped, about 500 kilometers in diameter, 22 kilometers deep, with some variability along the rim in terms of the actual depth. The floor is covered by these arcuate fracture patterns, which I'm going to talk about in detail shortly. There's also a central massif, which is roughly conical in shape and about 20 kilometers high. The rim is variable in height as you go around the circumference, which gives way to an ejecta, which is several kilometers, perhaps 10 kilometers thick near the rim, tapering outward. Compositionally, you see a diagenetic signature predominantly on this side of the basin. It's asymmetric. We don't really know the origin of that. I'm not going to talk about that today. The Bouguer gravity map is shown here, and that's been also been talked about by other speakers in the posters by Carol Raymond and others. So I'm not going to talk about that too much, but we do have this data as well. Okay, now the morphology of Rhea Sylvia may look highly unusual, but they're actually analogs in the solar system, and you find them on Saturn's mid-sized icy satellites, and this will make Jeff Moore happy. And the reason that's interesting is because those satellites, which are a little bit bigger than Vesta, have similar surface gravities, about 20 to 30 meters per second squared, which makes them directly comparable. You don't have to worry about gravity scaling so much. And these show here on the right on the right, this is the shaded relief map of Vesta. Here's the basin again with some profiles across Rhea Silvia, and then there's one across Beninia to the south here. And down at the bottom is a basin, a large 600-kilometer basin on Iapetus. And you see the comparison between the top and the bottom profiles where it's basically almost identical kind of shape in a general sense. A deep bowl with basically a large conical mound or massif in the center of it. And the only real difference is that the ones on Iapetus and Rhea are somewhat shallower, but still relatively deep. So the basic overall morphology is similar on these bodies. You have prominent massifs and deep profiles, but you don't have very prominent terrace development. No multi-rings that we can really identify, although the troughs may be a form of multi-ring formation of a sort. This suggests that basin collapse in a low-gravity world is dominated by floor uplift, and you don't really have much contribution from rim collapse, and that the composition of the bodies may not matter very much. It may matter in terms of the overall depth, but the overall morphology you see could be almost identical on the two bodies. There are a couple of differences. One is, again, the depth that I mentioned earlier, but also the fact that we don't see the arcuate and spiral floor fracture patterns on the Saturn basins as we do on Vesta. Now, this is a map that's been recently produced by the team showing these fracture patterns on the floor. This is the shaded relief combined with the color topography, but here you see the arcuate patterns. They're arcuate scarps and ridges, a few kilometers high. They form spiral, parallel, and perpendicular patterns with respect to the center of the basin. The dominant spiral pattern is here on this quadrant here. And they uniformly cover the entire floor of the basin. They also do not crisscross each other, indicating that they all formed more or less at the same time and almost certainly during the impact event itself rather than afterwards. When we first saw this on approach, we thought this was something that was unique to Vesta, but investigating the literature, you find that actually may not be true. Now, one of the first hypotheses that came forward was that these could be influenced by Coriolis. And in fact, if you look at the direction that you expect Coriolis to be in, they're consistent with it. If you remember the fact that the ridges and the scarps are actually perpendicular to the maximum direction of stress, so that the inferred direction of stress is actually going this way, curving in the proper direction for Coriolis. And it's also consistent with the fact that the formation time of the basin is 1 to 2 hours, which is a large fraction of the rotation period of Vesta itself. So Coriolis could work. However, the floor fracture patterns are also visible on other planets if you know where to look. On the left is a geologic sketch map of Upheaval Dome, an impact crater in Utah. And you can see that in the central area there are radial and indeed a couple of spiral patterns formed by fractures in that basin. There are a couple other examples, Gosses Bluff and Sierra Madera, for example, come to mind. Also on the moon, you wouldn't expect to see it because of all the impact melt, but in fact, King Crater, and this is a blow-up of the floor here, is actually quite interesting because King Crater is one of the largest craters that formed on the moon on a steep slope, or relatively steep slopes. So basically, what happened was that during the impact, all the impact melt sloshed down to one side, which would be in this map here on this side here, leaving this part of the floor relatively exposed. And you can see that they're coming off the central peak here. There's an arcuate set of scarps here. And also in this particular area is very interesting because you have this sort of basket weave effect of overlapping arcuate structures as well. The fact that we see it is because all the impact melts slosh down to one side. So it's quite interesting. You also see it in theoretical calculations. These are slip lines for radial convergence, and here's a couple of plasticine models that were done. I forget which one. I think this was Alleman and Thomas, in which you have radial convergence and you form these slip lines along the model because, in fact, what's happening is that material is rushing in towards the center of the basin, and it doesn't like to do that because of the volume constraints, and it has no place to go except to crumple. And this is a sketch map I pulled out of the literature showing the basic concept. It's kind of like the wrinkled carpet on the floor kind of idea, except it's in a radial sense. So what you have is that the radial and arcuate patterns we see on the floor of Rhea Silvia are probably a consequence of radial convergence during floor collapse, and they form a radial transpressional ridges, some of which fracture and create fracture scarps. Coriolis probably controls the preferential direction in which these planes form, but by itself it cannot obviously fracture rock. So you need something else, and this is the mechanism that's probably responsible. Why do we see these fractures at all? This relates to the question of whether there's impact melt in Rhea Silvia, and this is one of those things that has been of some interest because of the issue of whether impact melt would form at all in this kind of environment due to the low impact velocities out in the asteroid belt or due to the low gravity of the body itself. And you get a hint by looking at other basins. This is Orientale on the moon, and this is the profile on the bottom. You see the flat floor in the center here. You don't see any of that type of thing in any of the profiles. This is just one of the profiles from Rhea Silvia. You don't see any flat floor on Rhea Silvia at all. It's got rugged slopes everywhere, irregular topography, indicating that there's no large body or large pooling of impact melt at the base of the basin, at the floor of the basin, which is what you might expect. That doesn't mean there isn't any impact melt, but it just means that there isn't any large significant quantity on Rhea Silvia. You do, in fact, when you look closely, you do see a couple of examples of flow-like textures on the floor of Rhea Silvia. Here's a couple. Here's one here. There's another. There's a couple more I don't have time to show. And there's a scale bar on the side to indicate what it is. You notice that they look somewhat eroded. Rhea Silvia does have a regolith that's formed on it. These have a number of craters on them. No age dating has been done yet on them to determine what their relative age is compared to other areas. But it does suggest that they are possibly as old as the basin itself and may be flow textures on the surface of Rhea Silvia. But again, you don't see any significant ponding. Like there's none here, for example, that would be indicated that there was a large volume of it. It's just a relatively small volume again. Okay, so let's look at from another point of view in terms of what does the overall shape and dimensions of Rhea Silvia, how does that fit in with the rest of the craters that we see on Vesta and also in the other parts of the solar system? And one of the standard ways of doing that is to do a depth diameter plot, which is what this is, of craters on Vesta. And I'm looking here only at those craters formed after Rhea Silvia so that we don't have to look at craters that have been mantled by ejecta or eroded and have a thick regolith on them. And that's what is shown here. You notice that the curve ends here at about 65 kilometers. That's because there are no craters larger than that formed after Rhea Silvia. So the curve is sort of truncated here at the long end. These two are degraded basins, and then, of course, I've got Rhea Silvia and Venenia here at the end. You also notice that I call them transitional because this is what they look like. They tend to be out of round, and they have irregular floors with large mounds and ridges on them like that. They tend to look like this. The smaller craters, which are simple craters, look like just standard bowls. They're pretty straightforward. The takeaway point here is that the intercept between these two curves, between the transitional or complex curve and the simple curve, is about 28 kilometers. And you notice that Rhea Silvia actually falls right along that line, which indicates it's probably not relaxed since its formation. What does that mean for whether gravity controls basin formation? And this goes back to an idea that's been floating around for a while, that if you take a look at the transition from the simple to complex morphology, it scales inversely with the gravity of the target body. And this is data based on information prior to both Cassini and Dawn. And this was our prediction, that the transition would be about 60 kilometers or so. But in fact, what we see is that the transition turns out to be, at least we believe it to be, about half that, about 28 to 30 kilometers or so. And pretty tightly confined. And it also turns out that when you look at the Saturn satellites with the newer, much higher resolution Cassini data, it turns out that those numbers that we got from Voyager were a little too high. and that if you replot everything, you actually get a correlation with gravity of minus about 0.7 instead of minus 1, so that the correlation doesn't appear to be quite so straightforward as it used to be. Now, there may be strength effects that are coming in terms of what's happening to control crater collapse on these bodies, particularly Vesta and the Saturn satellites. But that's a matter for further investigation. So there's some surprises there. So in general, to conclude, the general morphology of Rhea Silvia, as we see it today, is probably due to the low gravity of these bodies. We see the similar type morphology on Saturn satellites, and not controlled so much by the composition of the target. And we see the same basic structure on whether it's icy or rocky. The tectonic floor pattern that we see on Vesta may actually be rather common. The reason we see it on Vesta is that we don't have the impact melt to cover it. The spirals and the arcuate patterns may be a normal artifact of radial convergence during collapse. And again, the low volume of Vesta is confirmed. It was suspected based on calculations due to lower impact velocities in the asteroid belt, and we seem to confirm that. At least observationally. And trough formation may actually predate ejecta emplacement from the basins. I really didn't talk about this, so I'm just going to leave it there. And the transition to complex morphologies may only be partially controlled by gravity, although it does seem to be the dominant control. There may be definitely an influence of strength. So thank you, and answer questions.
One comment. It's a very nice job, and it's very promoting to make modeling. But I have a very simple comment. The inverse 1/G scaling, it's in reality the ratio between strength and gravity forces for the same scale. So why you put strength separate? We have Mars and Mercury, where the same gravity, but very different position of simple to complex crater transition. So it's inside the Richter planes we have the example where the same gravity planet have very wide different diameter of crater in transition. So why not here? Why you separate here strength so well?
Because I don't really have a way to do that very easily. That's something we should definitely talk about, so I can do that properly.
Any other questions? Carol?
So, Paul, since Rhea Silvia covers over the older Saturnalia basin, then you might expect that the crust in the overlapping region was already an impact redshift or highly fractured. Would that change what you would expect to see in terms of that radial ridges?
I think that might, in the sense that the area where we see it most arcuate and most spiral actually appears to be the side opposite of where it overlapped with Venenia. So we may have had a more coherent signature out there in that quadrant. That was the one. That's the quadrant opposite of the Venenia overlap quadrant. So that might make sense. We also clearly see a very clear difference in the relief on the rim in the area where it overlapped Venenia. But the shock wave from Rhea Silvia itself probably bridgeated everything to I don't want to say a uniform degree, but may have homogenized things as it went out in advance of the excavation. So how much of a difference it's going to make is something we would need to talk to somebody like Boris or Eric or somebody else who could tell us about that. But yeah, it's definitely something that could make a difference in the morphology, and it appears to already in terms of the rim relief and possibly the floor morphology. We'll have to look at that more closely and see if it correlates.
Thank you very much, Paul. final talk of this session, Don and Vesta, surface morphology after the mapping phases, will not be given by Marie DeSantis. It's going to be Jean-Philippe Lacombe. Oh, just do this, and it'll flash yellow at 5.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. We are concluding this session with a summary of results obtained so far with visible and infrared mapping spectrometer, VIA. VIA is an imaging spectrometer that it takes images, and for each pixel of the image, it acquires a whole spectrum from the ultraviolet at 0.25 micrometers to infrared at 5.1 micrometers. And the graph on the left shows I over F as a function of wavelength. This is the percentage of light reflected by the surface altered by all the effects of illumination conditions and geometry of observation, and also the thermal emission. The sharp rise you see at long wavelengths is a thermal emission. And all the results I'm going to show you tonight are from the spectral analysis of spectra at wavelengths shorter than 3.5 micrometers, just like the spectra shown at the center here. So we are avoiding thermal emission. We are investigating the range of thermal emission and for the thermal correction, but I don't have any results and conclusions to show you today. So the different mapping phases of VIA follow the different orbits, altitudes of dawn, starting from survey at more than 2,700 kilometers away from the surface. We had a good coverage of the south hemisphere, and the south pole is a red dot at the bottom here. Then we had a high altitude mapping orbit at 680 kilometers from the surface. The mosaic shown here is not the entire dataset from this phase, but it shows you the pattern of the sequence of images and the spiraling orbit around Vesta. And then we had the low altitude mapping orbit at 220 kilometers from the surface. We achieved a spatial resolution of 70 meters per pixel in some places, but we have very few areas covered that way. And finally, we went into high altitude mapping orbit again, and this time we had a better coverage of the north hemisphere here, where the illumination was better than in the first high altitude mapping orbit phase. So we acquired a total of more than 20 million spectra with spatial resolution ranging from 1.3 kilometers to 70 meters per pixel. And to make global maps, we had to combine hundreds of images and like this map here. So this map has been obtained from all the mapping phases except the last one. That's why we don't have coverage of the northern hemisphere. And this is a reflectance at one wavelength that has been corrected for the photometric effects. And I will show you this map several times as a comparison to other maps of the composition. So here you don't see much of the effects of the topography, for example. So first I'm going to focus on the composition, the mineralogy. The spectra on the right here have been normalized using a continuum removal procedure so that we can accurately determine the position of the absorption bands. The bright dots is an average spectrum of Vesta obtained with VIA, and it's dominated by two strong absorption bands at 0.9 micrometers and 1.9 micrometer. It's characteristic of pyroxenes. And this has been observed early on from telescopic observations by McCord et al. In 1970, and also many more observations during several decades. And this was the first evidence that Vesta is is a differentiated and evolved body. And during several decades also we made a comparison with a type of meteorites that shows similar spectral features, the HEDs for forwardite, eucrite, and diagonite. And for a long time we investigated the link between the HEDs and Vesta as a possible parent body. The solid curves shown here are spectra of HEDs. Diagonites have absorption bands with centers shifted towards shorter wavelengths. Diagonites are magnesium-rich types of pyroxenes, and they are formed deeper into the crust of the parent body. On the other hand, we have eucrite, so there are the cyan spectra with the position of the absorption bands shifted towards longer wavelengths, and eucrites are made of calcium-rich plagioclase and calcium-poor pyroxene, such as pigeonite. And eucrite is formed closer to the surface of the parent body. And in between, we have howardites that are intimate mixtures of the two in breccias. So, to investigate the link between the HEDs and the VR spectra, we are doing spectral analysis. The depth of the absorption bands of pyroxenes is sensitive to many things, the composition, the abundance, but also the grain size and the photometric effects. The position of the band is more diagnostic of the composition. And if we plot the position of the band 1 of pyroxene as a function of band 2 of pyroxene, we have this positive correlation. It's diffuse, but there is a correlation. The plus signs are data from Vesta, and the variation of colors indicates the density of points. So where it's darker, it's more dense. The ellipses come from spectral analysis of HED spectra, with diagonite on the lower left and eucrite on the upper right. And what is interesting here is that the two plots match. The spectra from Vesta and the spectra from the HEDs are consistent with each other. And also, the diversity we see from this plot on Vesta is consistent with the diversity seen in the HED meteorites. So that's consistent with the idea that Vesta is a parent body of the HED meteorites. We can map also the composition, and this is a map on the top, where, so this is a position of the band 2 of pyroxenes. Blue is for diagonite and yellow is for eucrite. We have some spatial diversity, and this is compared with the albedo map. So we have more diagonite-rich material associated to brighter materials here. On the right, we have a map centered at the South Pole, and we have, again, a more diagenetic composition at the South Pole and brighter materials. On this slide, there is a comparison of the position of the pyroxene absorption bands at 1 micron on the left and 2 microns on the right. There are similarities that are consistent with the correlation we see on the 2D scatter plot, but there are also differences because the two bands are sensitive to different types of materials. So, to summarize about the pyroxenes, we see some variations at global scale, especially between the equatorial regions and the southern regions. But we see also some spectral differences at local scale. And this is one example where we have a fresh crater near a cliff, which is actually the rim of Rhea Silvia. Rhea Silvia is on the lower left. And if we drop a map of the pyroxene composition onto the topography, we have also a very good indication of spectral diversity. So again, blue colors mean more diagenite component, and yellow is more eucrite composition. And we have also some variations as a function, variations in the absorption band depth, and we have the pyroxene bands are usually deeper on the slopes, and that indicates spectral diversity also in the stratigraphy. So besides pyroxenes, we looked for other components, and following the detection of OH and H2 at the surface of the moon, we we looked for the presence of OH and H2 on Vesta. And we found the narrow and weak absorption band at 2.8 micrometers that is characteristic to OH. We also found a more complex, broad and very asymmetric feature that is likely a combination of several vibration modes of the OH band and probably HOH as well. So if we map the 2.8 micron band depth, we obtain this map here, where brighter pixels correspond to deeper 2.8 absorption band. This has been published in De Sanctis et al. In 2012. And this is compared with the albedo map at the bottom here that shows an anti-correlation, also illustrated by this 2D scatter plot. So darker materials are often associated to deeper 2.8 absorption band. So there is a possible common origin of the dark materials and the OH-rich materials. And one explanation could be the infall of carbonaceous chondrite meteorites, as published in McCord et al. In Nature 2012 also. At local scale, we observe also this anti-correlation between albedo and the depth of the 2.8 micron band. But there are exceptions. There are areas where the surface material is bright and the 2.8 micron band is strong. So the hypothesis of a carbonaceous chondrite meteorites doesn't explain all the OH we have at the surface of Vesta, and it is still under investigation. So to conclude, well, about the pyroxenes first, we have pyroxenes everywhere at the surface of Vesta, and there is not a single pixel from there that do not have the two pyroxene absorption band. So that's a bit of a surprise, but that's consistent with the telescopic observations. And we do have some mineralogical diversity at Vesta in the pyroxenes that is consistent with compositional diversity observed in the HED meteorites. So that's in favor of the link and between the HEDs and Vesta, with Vesta being the parent body. The diversity in the pyroxenes is seen as at global scale. It's also observed at local scale in fresh craters and also in the stratigraphy with diagenitic rich components corresponding to materials excavated from the lower crust of Vesta. And so this diversity is consistent with a body that has undergone a complex history of a geological evolution similar to the terrestrial planets. And finally, about the OH at the surface, well, this is still under investigation. The hypothesis of carbonaceous chondrite meteorites for the origin of OH is one explanation, but there are regions that are not consistent with this hypothesis. So we are still doing some investigation and some comparison with the surface of the moon, from which we can learn more about the processes of formation of OH. So thank you for your attention.
Questions for John Philippe? Forrest.
Okay, no one word about olivines.
We are looking for olivine, and we haven't made any positive detection yet.
Any other questions?
It's very difficult to detect olivine because even in mixtures, when we have about 25% of olivine and the rest of pyroxene, in lab measurements, it's very difficult to detect olivine. So it's very likely that olivine is present, but it's very possible that we cannot detect olivine.
Casey.
Using the longer wavelengths, 3 to 5 microns, and new thermal maps will be generated.
Yeah, we can generate temperature maps, but since the conditions of illumination vary, it's not a temperature map, it's a temperature mosaic, if you want. But from this investigation, we can derive some information about thermal inertia, for example, that tells us something about the physical structure of the surface. So we are doing this, and there are some papers in preparation, and one by Maria Teresa Capria, for example.
Is it possible to speculate about whether the HED meteorites are from a single impact, and so we should figure that?
From via spectra, I don't know. For example, we cannot directly identify the region where the HED meteorite come from just by analyzing via spectra. So maybe someone in the down team has more insights on this question.
I did a little calculation that shows that about that Rhea Silvia would eject about twice the volume of material that Venenia would. So, and those two events would dominate the population. Of course, now they're different ages, and so there's going to be different bleed off into the transition zones. But the Vesta family would be primarily a mixture of those two, with some admixtures from other impacts. Okay, let's thank Jean-Philippe again.
Thank you.